So I'm here to talk about a case study that I've done with Stefan Durkon, who's also at the University of Oxford, and he's currently on leave at the Department for International Development in the UK. Yeah, what we have is also information on sort of 10 years over time, and we're looking at rural Ethiopia from 1994 to 2004. Now, the data that we use was collected by IFPRI along with the University of Oxford and the University of Addis Ababa. It began in 1989 and then continued between 94 and 2004. Now, whereas Agnes had data from sort of the beginning and then 10 years later, what we have is also some information from in between times. So we can look at the beginning and the end of those 10 years, and we can also look at the sort of bumps and directions that people take over time, and that adds a lot of more information, but it also sort of makes things a little bit more complicated as to how you compare different people's experiences when you have more information. Some people are sort of going up over time, some people are going down, but there are a lot of movements along the way. People experience these negative events or adverse shocks, as we've been calling them. And so what we've tried to do is sort of condense some quite complex information about people's lives and be able to look at sort of overall trajectories on sort of people who seem to be stuck in poverty over the 10 years and have not managed to come out even for a short period, and then also people who began in 1994 looking fairly well off relative to the rest of the group, but then have somehow ended up in poverty by the end of the 10-year period, and what might have driven these different movements over time. And so just to tell you briefly what we found, we actually found that the famine that happened in 1984 still, despite all the different things that have happened, seems to be a very important predictor of chronic poverty over time. In addition to that, we found that if you sort of looked at people in 94 and sort of before you found out what would happen to them over the 10 years, definitely the people who were going to stay poor had fewer assets in 1994, but those people did actually, their incomes did grow over time, and their consumption. And we found what was important in terms of pushing people down was, as Bob was saying earlier, this idea of sort of cumulative shocks where people might have experienced illness of one or two members of the family who earned income, and at the same time an agricultural shock like a crop failure or a drought or a pest of some kind. And then this seems to be something that triggers a point of no recovery. And so, again, Bob talked quite a bit in the beginning about what kind of policy implications we might have, and we found some differences, I think, between people who were declining into poverty and those who sort of began and stayed in poverty, which I'll talk about a bit later. So, as I said at the beginning, the methodology became a little bit complicated in the sense of, sort of if you have five measures over time, and it's quite easy to sort of distinguish people who are chronically poor if they're always in poverty. Every time you visit them, they're always poor. And then there'll be people who are sort of never poor over the 5 years. But the rest of the people, it tends to be, have bumped up and down or have experienced perhaps 2 of the 5 times that we visited them, they were poor. Other people, 3 of the 5 times they were poor. And how do you sort of rank those different experiences if you're trying to get some kind of aggregate information in order to draw out trends? So it was quite tricky to sort of think of how we could do that. And we basically went sort of back to the beginnings of using the head count and the poverty gap measures that have been broadly used, sort of the dollar a day type thing, and just extending that a little bit over time. And we used a kind of cut-off of sort of, what about if everybody who is poor 3 out of 5 times is called chronically poor? And what about if on average your consumption is always, every time we visited you, on average your consumption is below the poverty line? So I think a lot of people in IFPRI are very familiar with the Ethiopian Rural Household Survey data. As I said, it's collected with us in Oxford as well as the University of Addis Ababa. We're using data from 1994 to 2004, so it's pre-food price crisis. And there are 15, you might say, villages in Ethiopia, and we used about 1,100 households. So, well, the discussions about how representative it is when it's only 15 villages, but it's broadly representative of the agricultural regions. And again, we believe that poverty is multidimensional in nature, but we had to simplify things given all our information, so we've used sort of a consumption measure adjusted for inflation and adjusted for the number of people that were in the household. So a little table just to show you. So in 1994, about 40% of the households that we visited were having consumption below this poverty line, which was sort of enough to buy you 2,000 calories a day, and plus some very small amount of non-food expenditure like firewood, for example. So 94, it's sort of just 40%, and by 2004 it had dropped to about just over 20%. So it had halved in this period, and that's not untypical, I think, of Ethiopia, which was experiencing, at least on aggregate, some economic growth, some agricultural growth. But of course, Ethiopia is a very drought-prone country. A lot of people are very dependent on agriculture, and therefore they're dependent on the weather, which drives these ups and downs. So if you take, for example, what Agnes explained about the transitions between sort of 94 and 2004, of those 40% who were poor when we saw them in 94, just under a third of those were still below the poverty line in 2004, which is about just under 10% of all the households. And a higher percentage of households did move out of poverty than into it, which is the good news. And just over half were never poor in either time. So that explains basically our broad trend that poverty had sort of halved over those 10 years. And here we just sort of count the number of times that we saw people in poverty, like I was saying. So we see that actually only sort of 2.5% of households were poor every time we visited them. Now, there may be some issues around sort of measurement problems. Maybe people misremembered things. Maybe it looks like they were bumping up and down, but they actually weren't. But overall, I think we can say that there is a lot of variability. And of course, when there's variability in people's consumption, that also means vulnerability and insecurity. And I think in qualitative work on Ethiopia, that comes out a lot, that people really feel worried about the future, worried about the potential of especially weather-related issues, droughts, whether their animals are going to live, whether their crops are going to survive. This is a rural survey, so of course we focus a lot on the rural issues. So to summarize sort of what the characteristics we find of the chronic poor is, we do find sort of geographical concentration. In terms of ethnicity, I'm nervous to say too much about it because I don't think that the ERHS is really a good data set to look at that, but we did find that the two biggest ethnic groups did have the lowest rates of chronic poverty. We found a strong link between illness and chronic poverty, and there's probably a lot of two-way causality going on there. People are poorer, they're more likely to be ill. People who are ill are more likely to become poor because they can't work. So that on average, people who were chronically poor over the 10 years had at least one ill person in the house at any period that we visited them. And the non-chronic poor, it was sort of half of them had an ill person in the house. Also, in terms of their weight, I mean, Ethiopia already has a sort of an average BMI, which is substantially lower than a lot of countries. But 40% of the chronic poor have low BMI, what we would say underweight, compared to about 22% of the non-chronic poor. So already 22% are poor, even in the sample of the non-chronic poor. And as I said before, the 1984 famine, I mean, a lot of people would think, well, the 1984 famine affected the whole of Ethiopia, but we did some recall questions in 1995, I think it was, asking people about their experiences from the famine, and people sort of gave us rankings of how bad they found it, whether they were having to eat wild food that they wouldn't normally eat, whether they were reduced to just eating one meal a day, whether they had to sell their assets, those kinds of things. So we sort of made a measure of sort of exactly how bad did it get for people, even in a context of the whole country being in crisis. So the people who really suffered even more than on average really seem to not have been able to pull themselves back out of poverty by 2004. And in terms of sort of what reduced the probability of you being in long-term poverty, chronic poverty, it really was things like assets, as Bob discussed in the beginning, having better schooling, having more land, having more livestock, really did reduce the probability of being in chronic poverty, and also cultivating cash crops as well. Coffee is one example, and then there's something called chat that people chew in Ethiopia that also can reduce your poverty, as long as you don't become addicted to it. So is there any difference? Can we say that there is a difference between people who've stayed in poverty and people who've fallen into poverty? Well, definitely if you look in 1994, the people who were non-poor then, they did have more assets in the beginning. And I think it was the rainfall and the agricultural shocks seem to have particularly tipped these people into poverty, and possibly combined with the fact that when they had illness, the sort of the interaction between those two things as they played with each other, it sort of led people onto a downward spiral. And actually, interestingly, a higher share of agricultural income in 94 reduced the likelihood of you declining. So people who had more non-agricultural income in this rural area were less likely to fall into poverty. And we didn't find that sort of schooling or gender of the household heads were predictors of you actually falling into poverty. They were predictors of you sort of staying in poverty for the long term. So those were the sort of differences. So to sum up, I mean, we've already had a little bit of policy discussion, and I'm sure people are keen to start discussing things now. But you know, if you look back to 1994 and look to the future, we had 40% of the households were in poverty, and really only a few of those would actually stay all the way through compared to the average. But many people would fall into poverty, and many people would experience bouts of poverty over those 10 years. And this contributed to a feeling, I think, of insecurity and vulnerability. I've talked about the 1984 famine, talked about having low assets, and basically rainfall. People seem to cite rainfall, you know, as the key problem for them. They're very dependent on rainfall. If it fails, it's very difficult. So I think assets, building up assets, and education and employment opportunities have already been talked about. And of course, in 2003-04, the government introduced this safety net, which was a broad safety net program which is being rolled out over the whole country, which we can't quite talk about in this survey, but you know, I know a lot of people in IFPRI are already doing work on the idea of a comprehensive safety net which is very predictable and also helps people to sort of build their assets up and not sort of worry as much about the future. And I know people also in IFPRI are working on things like rainfall insurance to deal with these sort of the idea of helping people to address their feelings of vulnerability and insecurity. Okay, thanks very much.